Today, mass migration into the United States looks like this: hundreds and thousands of people walking by foot across the southern US border into the United States. But if you rewind the clock just 200 years ago, mass migration to the US looked like this: millions of people coming to America by ship. In this video, I want to focus on the time period between 1880 and 1920. As you can see, millions of people were coming to America during this time. Of the more than 3 million people coming from the Russian Empire, over 2 million were Jews. These Jews were coming from a very specific area known as the Pale of Settlement, which was an area where a lot of Jews lived. And so I want to explore this journey of being in Russia, coming to America, and then that life in America using movies. In this episode of Yiddish Kino Club, I want to look at the Great Wave, which got its name by being the largest of the 5 waves of Jewish immigration. And as a child of Soviet immigrants from the most recent wave, I am interested in both immigration and how that has an influence on Jewish identity. If you're new here to this channel, my name is David, and on this channel I like to explore what it means to be Jewish by looking at Jewish history, art, like movies, and Jewish culture. So let's talk about the Ellis Island Experience. In fact, a few years ago, I actually had the chance to go to Ellis Island. Yeah, that's me trying to blend into the past, I guess. But I want to draw your attention to a couple of posters that I saw there. And let's start with this one. This is a poster trying to raise money for World War One war effort. It's written in Yiddish, but let's pay attention to the symbols in the image. You can see the immigrants in the foreground, the Statue of Liberty, the golden city of New York, with a red, white, and blue rainbow in the background, and there's a ship in the middle ground. And these symbols are really important to this generation, not just because of how captivating these images are, as you can see in this depiction of immigrants coming to America and seeing the statue and this incredible moment, but also because of the symbolism. Let's take a look at this Rosh Hashanah greeting card from 1920. You can see the Jews on the right side of the card underneath the emblem of the Russian Empire. And they're looking also very Russian in the way they're dressed. And on the left side, you can see the Statue of Liberty in the far background underneath the bald eagle with the American shield. And you can see the American Jews are dressed in a different, more modern fashion. And you can see the steamship representing the crossing over of this gulf of water. And so we see that this journey is more than just a change of location, it really deeply impacts Jewish identity. So let's jump into the Ellis Island Experience. I want to explore how movies depict it in 3 parts. First, we're going to look at why Jews had to leave the Russian Empire. Second, we'll look at the actual Ellis Island Experience. And third, we'll look at the reality of what life was like once Jews arrived in America during this time. So let's begin with the reason why Jews had to leave the Russian Empire. And to do that, let's start with this movie, American Tail from 1986. It was directed by Don Bluth, and it follows the story of a young Jewish mouse named Fievel and his family, the Mouskowitzes. Now, what's interesting about this movie is that it portrays real events in a very simple way that children can understand. And the way it does that is by showing us a couple of seconds of things happening in the real world, in human world, and then pans down to the much more simplified mouse world. And we're going to return to this a couple of times throughout the story. But to start us off, we actually see a pogrom, an attack on the Jews of the town.
Shh! They'll hear you. How could they hear us?
First, we see the human version of the pogrom, and then the mouse version, where the attackers are portrayed as cats. But a more realistic version can be seen in the 1971 Fiddler on the Roof, which was directed by Norman Jewison. And again, no, Jewison wasn't Jewish, but the main actor, Chaim Topol, was Jewish. We can see a couple of interesting historical moments in the film, specifically the aftermath of the assassination of the Russian Tsar, Alexander II, in 1881. There's a scene where an official from the Russian government comes to the constable of the town of Anatevka, where Tevye lives, and you could see the portrait of the new Tsar, Nicholas II, hanging on the wall. The official informs the constable that they're overdue for a Jewish attack, a pogrom.
No, sir. I'll take care of it, of course.
The constable tries to warn Tevye.
A pogrom? Here?
No. Just a little unofficial demonstration.
But there's the scene during Tevye's daughter's wedding where the constable shows up with a mob. Although they inflict some damage because Tevye and the constable are friends, they pretty much leave him alone.
I said enough! Come!
But then there's this montage of them destroying the Jewish part of the town. And eventually the Jews of Anatevka are expelled, and Tevye and his family decide to move to America.
Chicago, America? We are going to New York, America. We'll be neighbors.
Another movie that explores a similar theme and actually continues the story of Fiddler on the Roof is An American Pickle, directed by Brandon Trust, and it stars Seth Rogen in the main roles, I should say, both as Herschel Greenbaum, an immigrant from the Russian Empire to America, who basically gets brined in a pickle vat for 100 years and then wakes up to meet his great-grandson, Ben Greenbaum. And in the beginning, in the prologue, we see the pogrom that occurs in Herschel's town, again during a wedding, and this forces him and his wife to emigrate out of the Russian Empire. And this takes us to the second part of our story, the actual Ellis Island Experience. So continuing with American Pickle, Herschel and his wife come into America. Again, we see the scene of the Statue of Liberty. They come into Ellis Island.
Compared to Cossacks, Americans, very kind.
All right, this way, you filthy Jews. Let's go.
As we saw at the outset, Jews were not the only group of people who were immigrating to America at the time. This painting shows us an Italian father who is saying goodbye to his family and is leaving to America, and they don't know if they're ever going to see him again. And this scene of saying goodbye is also portrayed in the movie Brooklyn, which is about an Irish woman who immigrates to America, although her story is a little different, as we'll see, because she immigrates to a more upper-class neighborhood in Brooklyn. The film was directed by John Crowley, and there's this scene of the woman saying goodbye to her family as the ship pulls away. Now, if you were arriving into New York at the time, it would have looked something like this. Now, what's notably missing from the New York skyline are the skyscrapers. And that's because they would start to rise towards the end of this era, around the 1920s, but in the 1880s, there were no skyscrapers yet. You could see Trinity Church towering over Manhattan, and at the bottom of Manhattan, you see that park, which is the Battery, and next to it is that round building called Castle Garden. And this was the precursor to Ellis Island, where immigrants arriving into New York came through and were processed, and eventually it closed in 1890. In fact, in American Tail, Fievel's family, the Mousekowitzes, actually arrive not to Ellis Island, but Castle Garden. Again, we see this motif of first showing us the human world arriving in, and then we see a very similar scene mirrored in the mouse world. There's also this moment where we see how the names were changed, both in the human world.
Name?
Smovolodny Dromovichki.
Okay, Mr. Smith.
And then in the mouse world.
Papa, why did they change my name to Tilly?
And this gives us an insight into how this crossing over wasn't simply just changing location, but having a deep impact on identity, both in a civic sense about being Russian or American, but impacting much more personal sense of Jewish identity. Now, Fievel in American Tail happens to gets blown off the ship and arrives into America on his own. There's also the scene where he sees the Statue of Liberty and eventually gets helped by a French pigeon who just so happens to be constructing the Statue of Liberty. And there's this scene at the end where they're flying away and you see a wide shot of the Statue of Liberty under construction. And this is in fact based on a historical image of how the Statue of Liberty looked in 1886, which is the year it opened. Now, the French pigeon is actually a stand-in for a real person by the name of Frederick Auguste Bartholdi. Bartholdi is the artist who created the statue, and he based his design on a couple of inspirations. First of all, the statue itself is the goddess of liberty, or Libertas. In fact, there's another statue of the goddess Liberty on top of the United States Capitol. But the pose and the style that this statue is made in is actually based on another mythical statue called Colossus of Rhodes. Now, there was an actual statue in the Greek city of Rhodes, but over time, the mythology around it evolved to have this stance where each of its legs were on two pieces of land and it holding up some sort of torch. You could actually see this image copied in Game of Thrones. You may recognize it from here. The Statue of Liberty has the same type of crown, the same type of pose with its hand up holding up a torch. And it was put up very similar time to Ellis Island, which opened in 1892. And so Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty ultimately become two parts of this larger experience. Now, what's interesting about the Statue of Liberty is that although the top half, the metal statue, was a gift from France made by Bartholdi, as we mentioned, the bottom half, the pedestal, needed to be put up by the Americans. And so the Statue of Liberty Committee tried to raise funds. The way they did that was by placing the head of the statue and the arm with the torch in a park in Manhattan called Madison Square Park. And this definitely got some eyeballs. Imagine walking down the street and seeing like a giant head in the park or a giant torch. Yeah, that would definitely get attention and people would give a donation. But another thing that occurred was that there was a poem commissioned by a Jewish poet named Emma Lazarus, who was in fact the descendant of the first wave of Jewish immigrants, the Sephardic wave. And her poem was called the New Colossus. She kind of redefined this pose of the mythical Colossus statue for this new era, for Jewish and general immigration into America. She begins her poem by referencing the statue of Greek fame with its limbs astride from land to land, like the Game of Thrones pose. But instead of being mighty and pompous, it's actually the mother of exiles, saying that refugees and immigrants were welcome into America. You probably recognize the line later in the poem, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." And then the last line is, "I lift my lamp beside the golden door." The golden door refers to the water in the upper New York harbor, which is where the ships coming into New York stop at Ellis Island and then eventually in Manhattan. You can see how the Statue of Liberty becomes a symbol of immigration, but can also be romanticized, like we saw in that poster on Ellis Island. But at this point, they need to stop and talk about the other side of the Statue of Liberty, the more darker side of the Ellis Island experience. And to do that, we should look at a very famous example of this, which is Godfather 2, starring Al Pacino. This film was directed by Francis Ford Coppola. In the first movie, we meet Vito Corleone as the elderly godfather who passes away by the end of the film. And then we see Michael Corleone, his son, at first not want to join the family business, which is crime, and eventually by the end of the movie becomes the Godfather. And so in Godfather 2, we get a flashback to Vito Corleone as a child, seeing him escape Italy and then come to America. But when we see the Statue of Liberty during his Ellis Island experience, it's obscured, it's blocked by a ship. And I think this comes to represent how Vito's path through Ellis Island becomes filled with obstacles and becomes symbolic and reflects on the larger story of his crime family in America. But in the flashback, we can see how he goes through Ellis Island. We see a scene where his name is changed.
Vito Andolini from Corleone.
Vito Corleone.
He's also inspected for disease and then put in quarantine. And there's this incredibly iconic shot where we see the Statue of Liberty reflected on the window in the same frame as the bars on his room. And we could see how the Statue of Liberty comes to represent this other side of Ellis Island that is not so glorious and romantic, but actually kind of painful and traumatic. Another movie where we can see the other side of the Ellis Island experience is The Immigrant, directed by James Gray. When we see the image of the Statue of Liberty, we see its back, which I think comes to represent the other side, the dark side of the Ellis Island experience. The opening to this movie is similar to the flashback in Godfather 2 because the main character comes across with her sister who is also sick and gets put into quarantine. And then this woman goes through a whole story to try to help her sister out as she finds her way in America. But what's so amazing about this movie is the recreation of the Ellis Island itself. You could see how jam packed the room was, how noisy, chaotic, and scary it must have been. Now, it's impossible for me to talk about The Great Wave without talking about my favorite movie, Hester Street, which was made by Joan Micklin Silver in 1975. And again, there's this scene where the husband comes to pick up his wife from Ellis Island. We see that he shaved his beard, he's not wearing a yarmulke, and his wife is still wearing a sheitel, a traditional wig, while his son has big, bushy side locks, big payas, and is wearing a keppel. And there's this moment before he picks her up that they're standing on two sides of a fence, which again goes back to this motif of crossing over, that you're not just changing location, but you're going from one side, from being a Russian Jew to being an American Jew. There's also this scene where the husband, Jake, is talking to the official to pick up his wife, Gittel.
Here's the marriage certificate.
And he shows the officer a ksuba, Jewish marital document, and it becomes symbolic in the story because later, when Jake and Gittel go separate ways, he gives her a get, a divorce document, in order to have this symbolic symmetry in the story. Also, in the movie Brooklyn, there's also a similar scene where she's very nervous going through the interrogation, and when she makes it through, there's this moment where she steps over the threshold through the door and is kind of absorbed by America. So now that we've gone through Ellis Island and we're actually in America, let's explore what life was actually like on the Lower East Side. Our first glimpse of the Lower East Side comes to us from the movie The Immigrant, where we can see the old tenement buildings, the hustle and bustle of the street. You can see the old-fashioned cars. One thing this movie also brings our attention to is this moment, which I call the immigrant moment, or the immigrant mentality, which is still being stuck in the old way of thinking. There's a poster I saw on Ellis Island, which looks like this, and it says, "Yes, we have no bananas. We have no bananas today." And this is an old song which goes back to a story that happened during this time. Bananas were starting to become really popular in America, and at one point there was a fungus which ended up killing a bunch of banana plantations, and so there was a banana shortage in America. There's actually a famous song by Louis Prima, which I absolutely love. Go check that out. But there's a moment in The Immigrant where this woman who just came over is given a banana and she's never seen one before, and she bites into the peel, and all the other women laugh and show her how to actually eat a banana. But I just love that moment where she still hasn't figured out what being an American is all about. We could also see beautiful shots of the Lower East Side in Godfather 2. You could see how The Immigrant was kind of inspired by this visuals as well. And there's a scene also where Vito is walking across the roofs, and you could see the tops of the tenements where people would hang out, and also the clothing hanging from the clotheslines. But if we're going to talk about the Jewish Lower East Side, we have to talk about one of the most incredible movies ever made, called Once Upon a Time in America. It is a very intense movie. First of all, it is almost 4 hours long, and it also has pretty dark subject matter, created by a man named Sergio Leone and starring Robert De Niro and James Woods. Also, the music was made by a man named Ennio Morricone. The score itself is one of the best scores of all time, definitely top 5 for me. But you probably know him from his very famous soundtrack from the film The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. There's a few scenes that occur on the streets of the Lower East Side, but there's one scene in particular that really stands out to me, which is a scene that takes place on Pesach, the holiday of Passover. What's so interesting is that even other movies that portray the Jewish Lower East Side is usually on a weekday where there's shops open and our attention is drawn to the signage, as we'll see very soon. But in this scene, because it's a holiday, all the shops are closed, but the men are walking down the streets in prayer shawls, and everyone's greeting each other saying Gut Yom Tif, happy holiday, for the holiday of Passover, which is something I don't think I've ever seen in a Jewish movie, at least not yet. But the interesting thing is that I'll touch on for just a moment is that this movie is all about Jewish gangsters, Jewish mobsters. Now, if you're familiar with the subject, you're probably thinking of people like Meyer Lansky or Bugsy Siegel, two of the most notorious Jewish mobsters of the 20th century. And this is a topic that deserves its own video, but just to explain it briefly, the fact that Jews were able to cross over into this new country gave them new opportunities, and an extreme example of that was the ability to be criminals. But a more mainstream and definitely more legal way of reinventing yourself can be seen in the film The Jazz Singer, starring Al Jolson, which was directed by Alan Crosland and came out in 1927. The film is about a man who wants to reinvent himself as a jazz singer, and in the earlier scenes that take place during his childhood, we can see the recreation of the Lower East Side, which is called the Jewish Ghetto in the film. And when he's singing as a child in a jazz bar, and his dad, the cantor, finds out and comes to bring him home, he throws him into the streets of the Lower East Side. And like I mentioned, we can't talk about the Lower East Side without talking about the all time legend, Abraham Kahn, who was the editor of the Jewish newspaper, The Forward. He also wrote the book The Rise of David Levinsky, which I highly recommend you read if you're interested in this time period, and also the book Yekel, which is what the movie Hester Street was based on. And in Hester Street, we can see what Jewish life was like on the Lower East Side by looking at the signage from the different stores, which are written in Hebrew, also the push carts that we see when Jake takes his son through Hester Street to teach him English, and also at the close of the film when the new couples are walking through the streets. But Hester Street also gives us other glimpses into what life was like. We can see how Jake is trying to have some alone time with Mamie, and they're on the roof of their tenement, but then a bunch of kids show up and roll up their mats right next to them, which is ruining their private time. We can also see an economic perspective in Hester Street, which shows us how the Jewish immigrants actually earned a living. We can see how people were working in small garment factories with foot powered sewing machines, creating suits and dresses for more upper class people who were living in Manhattan. We could also see the scene where Jake and Bernstein are walking home during the off season carrying their materials on their shoulder. And like I mentioned, the movie American Tail also shows us a very brief moment of a similar sweatshop before panning down to the world of the mice who are doing similar jobs. To circle all the way back to American Pickle, Herschel, when he first comes over to America, works in a factory which makes pickles, which is where he gets brined. So, as we step back from this incredible journey and experience, let's reflect a little bit on the legacy of Ellis Island. And to do that, I want to look at a pretty unlikely source, which is the movie Hitch with Will Smith and Eva Mendes. At one point, Will Smith's character is trying to impress her, and so he takes her to Ellis Island, and he's able to pull some strings and shows her a record of her great-great-grandfather. Now, happens to be she gets really emotional because turns out he actually abandoned their family.
I saw that going differently in my mind.
To me, what's really interesting about the scene is seeing the same hall at Ellis Island, but completely empty of people except the three characters in that shot. When I visited Ellis Island, I was in that same exact room, and the quietness was almost too quiet. Because I was familiar with how packed this room could actually be, seeing it that empty was eerily quiet. I almost heard the ghosts of the millions of people, especially the 2 million Jews who walked through that facility in order to come into America. And this is something that I reflect on when I think about my Jewish identity, the experience of coming through the Golden Door, passing the Statue of Liberty, going through Ellis Island and coming into the very harsh realities of America. That brings us to the end of this episode of Yiddish Kino Club. If you're interested in the movies I mentioned, a lot of these I already covered in previous episodes, like Fiddler, Hester Street, and American Pickle, and some of these I'll be covering in later episodes. So if you're interested, I put these episodes in the cards below. If you're new here, my name is David, and this channel, Yiddishkeit, is all about exploring what it means to be Jewish. And particularly, I'm really interested in exploring how immigration affects Jewish identity. And so I'm really excited to talk more about that in other movies, famous stories, and just obscure pieces of history that really interest me. Thank you so much for being on this journey with me, and I'm curious if there's anything in this story that really stood out to you. I would love to hear what that is, and if there's something about Jewish immigration or Jewish identity that you want to explore, I'd love to hear about that and explore that together.